Today we finally settle the debate about Israel-Palestine protests on college campuses. Look, I'm a lawyer. I'm not an idiot. Now, these protests have been all over the news, whether it's Columbia in New York, UCLA in Los Angeles, or in the backyard of Dean Chemerinsky's home. For example, on the night of April 30th at the campus of UCLA, pro-Palestinian supporters had occupied an encampment they built near the campus for over a week, demanding that UCLA divest from companies tied to Israel's war effort and boycott Israel-run universities. That night, a group of masked people entered the encampment and violently attacked the pro-Palestinian protesters. This attack happened hours after the outgoing UCLA chancellor declared the camp illegal. The violence continued for hours while campus security stood by waiting for backup or further direction. Eventually, the California Highway Patrol and Los Angeles riot police were able to resolve the chaos, but by this time at least 16 protesters had been significantly injured. No arrests have been made as of the filming of this video. The UCLA administration issued requests for assistance from the larger UC system on April 25th and April 26th to deal with those protests, but those requests were subsequently canceled. So today we're going to talk about the legality of the protests and counter-protests at UCLA, Columbia, and the dean of the UC Berkeley School of Law, Erwin Chemerinsky's backyard. And what about the dramatic, sometimes violent responses to the protests? Now, immediately after the April 30th incident, UCLA and the California governor's office launched investigations to find who was responsible for the slow reaction that night. UCLA Chancellor Gene Block issued a letter to the UCLA community addressing the deep pain seen on campus and offering support to students, faculty, and alumni affected by these events. In this letter, Block also called for the encampment to be disbanded, saying, quote, "In the end, the encampment on Royce Quad was both unlawful and a breach of policy." He wrote, "It led to unsafe conditions on our campus and it damaged our ability to carry out our mission. It needed to come to an end." Now, if you've never been to the UCLA campus, the Royce Quad is about as central to UCLA as it comes. It's right in front of Royce Hall and the Powell Library, and there were many reports of students being accosted and prevented from getting to class because of this particular encampment. Though it certainly appears that not all students were prevented from getting to class. Now, pro-Palestinian protesters attempted to refortify their encampment and hoped to continue protesting on the UCLA campus, but on May 2nd, after a 9-hour standoff which resulted in more than 200 protesters being arrested, the encampment was torn down by law enforcement for good. And tensions at UCLA had continued after the violence at the encampment. On Saturday, May 4th, around 20 professors protested outside of a gala held at the campus's Hammer Museum, where its outgoing director was being honored. Then on Monday, May 6th, several dozen more students were arrested. According to KTLA, these 43 individuals were detained for conspiracy to commit burglary and subsequently released after being processed. Now, protesters at other college campuses have been met with a much different reaction by college administrations. Columbia University student protesters built a similarly erected encampment on their campus, but no great incident of violence broke out there. Though instead, New York police broke into a campus building after learning that the building had been occupied, vandalized, and blockaded by protesters after the university asked them for support. Not surprisingly, Columbia has received mixed reactions to their response and their large-scale arrests of these students. But protesters haven't kept their activities just to college campuses. On April 12th, at a private dinner held at the UC Berkeley Law School dean's home, pro-Palestinian protesters interrupted the dinner to speak about tragedies suffered by Palestinians. Now, in the wake of all of these different events, many people have made a blanket pronouncement that all of these different protesters had First Amendment rights to conduct these protests. And similarly, others have made blanket pronouncements that none of these protests had First Amendment protection. But as usual, the truth lies somewhere in the middle because all three of these different scenarios are analyzed differently. Now, you're probably aware of the First Amendment, which protects the freedom of speech, the press, assembly, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. But one of the most important considerations when discussing the First Amendment is to understand that the First Amendment only restricts the government. So the First Amendment can only be violated by government actors or entities. This means that when we're talking about whether someone's First Amendment rights are violated, we're necessarily talking about whether a government official or agency has prevented those individuals from exercising their constitutional rights. The actions of private entities or other individuals are most likely irrelevant to whether your First Amendment rights are violated. Asterisks, there are always exceptions to that. But traditionally identified as the four protections of the First Amendment, speech, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government for redress, protesting may involve all four of those rights. Now, to understand the freedom of speech, you have to understand what speech is considered worthy of protection. But generally, freedom of speech is considered the largest category. And speech has been interpreted by U.S. courts to include both spoken and written speech, as well as other forms of expressive displays. Essentially, all expressions can arguably be considered speech and protected under the First Amendment, except for the narrowly excluded categories explicitly established by the court.
Universities' financial relationships with Israeli companies, a disentanglement of the universities from relationships with the Israeli government or military, and transparency as to the nature of those relationships where they currently exist.
Professor Mensati, what do you make of the demands as Professor Johnston had laid them out? Is that something you think colleges can achieve?
I think they're very unlikely to be achieved. You know, the protests of the 1960s, it was possible to achieve some kind of accommodation. First of all, one of the demands, an end to the military draft, received widespread support throughout society, and Richard Nixon's administration would make that happen. But on campuses themselves, there were some practical goals: Black studies programs, women's studies programs, co-education at the elite private universities, an end to parietals and in loco parentis regulations. There was a lot of ground for accommodation and compromise, and I don't see that much right now.
Professor Johnston, what do you make of that? Do you agree?
Well, I think that the easiest, simplest demand that they're making is a demand for transparency in their universities' relationships with Israeli institutions. And I think that that is something that is certainly winnable on a lot of campuses. I also think that in a lot of ways, the anti-apartheid movement of the 1970s and 80s is a much better analog than the mass student movement of the late 60s in some ways. And I think it's important to remember that in the case of the anti-apartheid movement, the calls for divestment on campuses began in the mid-70s, and it was a very, very long and slow process by which students were adjusting people's views of the crisis itself.
What do you